Tell Me So I Can Hear You, A Developmental Approach to Feedback for Educators by Eleanor Drago Severson, a Harvard Press publication, 2017. Chapter 1, A Developmental Approach to Feedback. Quote, "Alone we can do so little. Together we can do so much." Helen Keller. Feedback is more important in education today than ever before, as high-stakes decisions in schools and districts increasingly rely on performance evaluations and other standardized measures of success. Educators across the system, principals, assistant principals, coaches, teachers, district leaders, and more, are being asked to help other adults improve their practice through feedback. Indeed, there is a growing sense that feedback can and should be a powerful tool for educational change. When done well, for instance, feedback can directly inform and support improved instruction and instructional leadership. It can also help educators across roles more effectively create and sustain cultures of learning in their schools, districts, and teams. Put most simply and profoundly, feedback can help all of us grow. Yet, providing effective, meaningful, and actionable feedback can be challenging for teachers and leaders throughout the system. After all, doing so requires complex organizational, theoretical, pedagogical, and content area expertise, and, less frequently recognized but just as important, it requires the ability to deliver and relate feedback in ways others can actually hear and take in. A little bit about Eleanor Drago Severson. She is Professor of Education, Leadership, and Adult Learning and Leadership at Teachers College and Columbia University. A developmental psychologist, Ellie Drago Severson teaches, conducts research, and consults to school and district leaders, teacher leaders, and organizations on professional and personal growth and learning, leadership that supports principal, teacher, school, and leadership development, and coaching and mentoring in K-12 schools, university settings, and other adult education contexts. She is also an internationally certified developmental coach who worked with leaders to build internal capacity and achieve goals. Her work is inspired by the idea that schools must be places where adults and children can grow, and she is dedicated to creating the conditions to achieve this and to help leaders and educators of all kinds to do the same on behalf of supporting adults and youth. At Teachers College, Ellie is director of the PhD program in Education Leadership, teaches aspiring and practicing principals in Columbia University's Summer Principal Academy, and aspiring superintendents in the Urban Education Leaders Program. She also coaches principals, assistant principals, and teacher leaders in the Conn Fellowship Program for Distinguished Leaders. Teachers College has recognized her teaching with 3 awards. She earned her BA from C.W. Post, Long Island University, and her master's and doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship from 1998 to 2001. Prior to her work at Teachers College, she served on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education from 1998 to 2005, where she was awarded the Morningstar Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2005. Ellie is author of the best-selling books Helping Teachers Learn, Principal Leadership for Adult Growth and Development, 2004, and Leading Adult Learning, Supporting Adult Development in Our Schools, 2009, as well as Becoming Adult Learners, Principles and Practices for Effective Development, 2004, and Helping Educators Grow, Practices and Strategies for Supporting Leadership Development, 2012. She is also a co-author of Learning for Leadership, Development Strategies for Building Capacity in Our Schools, 2013, and Learning Designs, Reach the Highest Standard of Professional Learning, 2015. This is her book, Tell Me So I Can Hear You, A Developmental Approach to Feedback for Educators, 2017. This book introduces a new developmental approach to feedback that we call feedback for growth, drawing from and extending Robert Kegan's constructive developmental theory, which outlines the process and trajectory of development in adulthood. Our conceptualization of feedback for growth is grounded in the premise, borne out by research, that adulthood is not a monolithic or static life stage. Adults are not done learning and growing simply because they have reached an age of maturity. In fact, there is great developmental diversity in terms of how adults make sense of their work, lives, and their relationships. We often describe these different orientations to thinking, perceiving, understanding, and being, or ways of knowing, as the lenses through which adults see and interpret their worlds. You will learn more about the different ways of knowing throughout this book, but for now it might be helpful to know that adults with different ways of knowing orient to and prioritize different things, such as meeting concrete needs, the expectations of valued others, or their own ideals and judgments. A developmental approach to feedback recognizes that adults with different ways of knowing will need different kinds of supports and challenges in order to fully hear, understand, and implement feedback as they grow and learn over time. Similarly, adults with different ways of knowing will have different styles of providing feedback, which may or may not dovetail with the developmental needs of the people on the receiving end. To be most effective, then, feedback must take into account the different developmental capacities of both feedback givers and receivers. It must help us to meet each other where we are developmentally, and to nurture a deeper awareness of how we and others are making sense of the exchange. Yet, despite the great promise of a developmental perspective for enhancing feedback and communication, these ideas and their implications have been largely missing from the feedback literature. Accordingly, this book offers practical developmental strategies for improving performance and building capacity in our schools and organizations through our feedback and in our lives more generally. With this in mind, we call our approach Feedback for Growth, because it explicitly recognizes the expansion of our own and others' developmental capacities as central to the experience of good feedback. By developmental capacities, we are referring to the cognitive, affective, emotional, intrapersonal, self-to-self, and interpersonal, self-to-other abilities that we bring to problems of practice, relationships with others, and the larger value propositions we generate and encounter every day. These capacities, which you might also think of as our stores of internal reserves and perspectives, likewise influence how we orient to feedback, the kinds of feedback we need to grow, learn, and improve in our work, and our abilities to manage the mounting complexities of learning, teaching, leading, and living. Promisingly, when provided with the appropriate supports and challenges, we can continue to grow our developmental capacities over time, regardless of our roles and hierarchical positions, in order to more effectively see into and manage the complex languages associated with improving education. As we will share throughout this book, our conceptualization of feedback for growth stems from and expands our previous work about learning-oriented leadership and leadership development, and offers a close-up look at feedback as an outgoing process that can both strengthen performance and build internal capacity. For example, and as we will continue to explore, a developmental approach to feedback can help you better meet adults where they are developmentally, so that communications can best be heard and understood. Offer more constructive, helpful, and effective feedback during evaluations and other meetings, both formal and informal, that attends to both performance and developmental capacity. Bolster collaboration so that it is even more meaningful and productive, and so that teachers and other educators can work together more effectively and constructively, i.e. in teams, peer-to-peer observations, and in professional learning communities, or PLCs. Understand how your own development influences your capacities to give and receive feedback, and grow through the processes of giving and receiving feedback to support internal capacity, building, and performance. These are intimately connected, internal capacity and building and performance. Ultimately, by highlighting the ever-present but under-recognized developmental dimensions of feedback that operate just below the surface of almost any feedback exchange, this book expands the conversation about feedback and presents a promising roadmap for making feedback more meaningful, actionable, and growth-enhancing for all participants. New feedback imperatives. In our work with educators and leaders of all kinds, we have experienced what feels like a universal urgency around feedback. More specifically, as mounting policy initiatives and practical imperatives push this vital aspect of leadership and collaboration front and center. Principals, assistant principals, and district level leaders, as well as teacher leaders, coaches, mentors, university professors, and professional developers, emphasize that they want and need to get better at this important work. In particular, today's policies around new teacher and principal evaluations, the Common Core state standards, Race to the Top funding, and other initiatives have heightened the exigencies of giving and receiving feedback for educators within schools and across the system to achieve instructional excellence. For example, between 2011 and 2013, almost every state in the U.S. ushered in dramatic changes to its teacher evaluation systems. And in ways both big and small, collaboration continues to infuse our educational milieu as part of the new normal of contemporary life. Everywhere one looks, new feedback measures and approaches such as 360-degree feedback, as SMART goals, or mini observations, the Danielson framework, peer-to-peer feedback in teams and PLCs, instructional rounds, and learning walks all seek to improve student learning by framing, structuring, and delivering feedback to educators in strategic ways. Within the realm of teacher education, too, administrators and evaluators have been found to use more kinds of feedback and outcome measures to assess program performance than leaders in any other profession. Despite this proliferation of feedback, formative and summative, for formal and informal, throughout the education world, there remains a growing sense that we need to do something different in terms of feedback, not just something more. For one thing, the impact of growing emphasis on professional feedback seems mixed at best. In a recent empirical analysis, for instance, Hollinger, Heck, and Murphy pointed out that there is remarkably little evidence that associates the new generation of teacher evaluation with capacity development of teachers or more consistent growth in the learning outcomes of teachers. Importantly, this mixed bag of results extends beyond formal evaluation systems to include other forms of mentoring and collaboration, as educators often report that they are thrust into collaborative scenarios with little support or training about how to best work together in these new and essential ways. Speaking to this point, research is beginning to suggest that educators in some contexts may be getting too much feedback, as it is not uncommon for teachers to receive different and sometimes even conflicting feedback from supervisors, mentors, or coaches, colleagues, value-added measures, and other data streams, student and parent ratings, self-assessment tools, etc. Practitioners, too, increasingly report that these mountains of feedback do not necessarily translate into improved performance, as it can be difficult to filter, make sense of, prioritize, or even understand the large amounts of feedback that they encounter, let alone act upon it. In other cases, a lack of quality feedback systems to be creating a different kind of problem for educators, and it hopes to grow themselves and others. For example, not too long ago, a staggering 74% of teachers who participated in a study of 12 large U.S. districts reported that they received virtually no feedback or suggestions on their summative evaluations. Likewise, research has documented the steadily disappointing dearth of feedback for teachers containing actionable specifics or meaningful opportunities for reflection and analysis. While these different feedback challenges inarguably have multiple roots and causes, we find it significant that teachers and administrators, like so many of us, describe a lingering uneasiness with feedback as an authentic process. Regularly, for instance, educators express that they find it difficult to make their feedback stick, despite their best and most earnest efforts. Some could find that they feel uncomfortable giving honest feedback to colleagues as they worry that it might damage relationships or cause tension. Others struggle to break the habit of giving feedback just as they themselves would like to receive it, even when their preferred feedback styles, i.e. very direct, crisp feedback or feedback cushioned by positive affirmations, do not always work for everyone in their care. Still, other educators explain that they repeat their feedback messages over and over again, striving for consistency and fairness, but repeatedly run up against what feels like resistance and frustration on the part of colleagues. Despite these educators' best and most thoughtful feedback efforts, they concede that things are not working as they would like, given the growing awareness that ineffective feedback can actually push employees to be less committed and or more withholding of their best ideas. Looking anew at feedback through a developmental lens can help all of us do and see feedback better as we strive to reach common educational goals. A developmental Perspective. It is our contention that a developmental perspective can help shed light on the very important feedback challenges, patterns, and statistics, as has been just described. Time and again, when we work with educational leaders of all kinds, we notice that their questions and concerns about feedback have developmental dimensions. For example, leaders frequently report the following feedback challenges. It is hard for me to care for both the emotional and intellectual aspects of feedback in the moment. Sometimes I don't feel comfortable sharing my honest thoughts and feelings with my supervisees. Giving unsolicited or informal feedback is really hard, especially when I am not in a supervisory role. I find it challenging to refrain from criticizing or judging. I am working to remain mindful on my own internal states and capacities during feedback exchanges. I want to get better at approaching conflict and difference as opportunities for growth rather than moments to be avoided. I want to learn more about how and why others interpret my feedback so differently. One big goal I have for improving my feedback is balancing supports with constructive challenges. I'm coming to see that my feedback style and preference may not suit everyone equally. It is hard to simultaneously support and evaluate my colleagues' practice. I am never quite sure how best to follow up after giving feedback or receiving feedback. And as we will describe, these and other challenges related to giving and receiving feedback can actually be developmental in nature. By this we mean that these challenges can stem from a mismatch or misunderstanding of the internal developmental capacities of the feedback giver and or receiver. Accordingly, a deeper understanding of the developmental dimensions of feedback and the qualitatively different ways of knowing in adulthood can help us to effectively differentiate the kinds of supports and challenges we employ during feedback to best support the adults in our care. Importantly, though, appropriate supports and challenges will look and feel different to people with different ways of knowing. To further illustrate this key point, it can be helpful to think of one's way of knowing as the audio frequency with which one speaks or hears. Put another way, you could imagine the range of feedback an individual receives from others as the different radio stations on an old-fashioned dial radio. When not broadcast in ways tuned into the recipient's developmental orientations, feedback might sound more like static or those in-between channels that don't quite come in clear. On the other hand, when feedback is offered in ways that adults with different ways of knowing can actually hear and understand, it is more like finding that magical place on the dial where, suddenly, the music comes in loud and clear, and, if you're lucky, your favorite song is actually playing. Like one's taste in music, ways of knowing can feel more like a manifestation of one who is than something one has. Yet, unlike our musical preferences, human development seems to follow a particular progression and order throughout the lifespan, with each way of knowing reflecting an increased capacity to stand back and reflect on oneself and one's work. While each way of knowing in adulthood has both strengths and limitations, and adults will move to and through these stages at different rates and trajectories, the transition of each new way of knowing reflects a significant expansion of a person's internal developmental capacities. Because the mounting challenges we face in education today call for increases in these capacities over time, understanding the patterns of meaning making in adulthood can inform how we support and challenge each other so that we can all have deeper wells of self and interconnection to draw from. The real hopefulness of this approach in this book, then, rests on the fact that adults can and most often want to grow and learn, both when giving and receiving feedback and in general. Supporting growth, development, or transformational learning, we use these terms interchangeably. Again, interchangeably, the terms supporting growth, development, or transformational learning are used interchangeably. It is possible then and necessary in our schools and districts. And employing feedback for growth is one very promising path towards this essential and hopeful outcome. Introductory example. We will go over the next part, a developmental approach to feedback, in the next video, titled Capacity versus Expertise.